Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome to Through a Scottish Prism. I hope you're doing well. A continuation of my discussion with Finbar and Lloyd I had last week. I'm going to continue on, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed speaking to them. Let's get them right in here now. First in, Lloyd, welcome back, my friend.
Great to be back.
Absolutely. Finbar, welcome back, my friend.
Roddy, Lloyd, Scotland and beyond. Hello, as usual. How are you?
Royd will do. Royd and
Loddy. Royd and Loddy.
Loddy. Yeah, and that's without a drink. What can I tell you? Folks, moving on quickly because, you know, the clock is an enemy, as always. I don't want to get behind it already before we get started. So let's get going. The last couple of weeks have been really interesting. 2 weeks ago, Lloyd, or 10 days ago, something that our viewers will not have heard about, SPIEF, St. Petersburg's International Economic Forum. The Western media will have not covered it. There is actually more GDP in that room, and in that meeting, there was 136 nations went. What's now known as the Global South and the BRICS nations. And they have a higher GDP than the G7, probably the G20 as well. And it was totally ignored. A very significant and important meeting, but it was ignored by our media.
I think it's ignored by our media because the potential danger to particularly the European Union, but also, as you mentioned, the G7 and the G20 in the development of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS organization and its possible extensions is a real threat to the current economic structure of the Western world and of what we would term the Northern Hemisphere. And it's something that no one wants to talk about. No one wants to talk about it here because of the potential danger. But the fact is, it's moving along. It's moving along. It's attractive to a lot of countries who the G7 and the G20 particularly treat extremely badly. They treat them like the supermarket for minerals and for resources, so a bit like England treats Scotland in some ways. And I think we're looking at a major change in the world over the next little while. But also, because this is happening during the period of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, the state organizations, particularly the state media in the European countries, does not want to address this because the reaction would be, if they were to say anything positive about it, then you'd lose your job. And if you go down the route of being negative about it or even bringing it up, then you suddenly discover that Russia has allies way, way beyond simply Belarus. And that is it's a worrying concept, I think, for many people, especially here in the UK, where we are so dependent on the buying and selling of money and of resources in other countries. This is a major threat to the British Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange, and I would say the German Bund as well.
Yeah, and you wonder, you hear us all saying it lots of time, folks. Whenever anything's happening, follow the money. Finbar, I'd like to play a small video before I ask this question, but here's a wee hint of why the Americans seem to be so invested in continuing the slaughter in Ukraine. And this is one of your friends, Lloyd, Senator Lindsey Graham.
What did Trump do to get the weapons flowing? He created a loan system. They're sitting on $10 to $12 trillion of critical minerals in Ukraine. They could be the richest country in all of Europe. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal. deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin 10 or 12 trillion dollars of critical minerals that he will share with China is ridiculous.
Follow the money, Finbar. What do you think?
I'm minded when I see that. I'm minded or reminded of one of the catalysts that brought around the Ukraine conflict in the first place. When I say a catalyst, not about the long-term planning on the part of the Americans, but an incident. And in 2013, Ukraine was having a financial crisis. And they were in negotiations with Europe to join the EU. And they put out an appeal to all parties, Russia and the EU, for assistance and to the World Bank. The Europeans and the Americans offered them pittance compared to what they needed. The Russians said, we'll give you all the cash you need and we'll give you free energy. Does that sound like a country that wants to come in and steal all your assets? A country that was quite willing to actually positively give you so that you would be in the positive all the time and that they would be in the negative to a degree to maintain a friendship and to retain a country that was neutral on its borders. So the idea that Russia wanted to seize these assets, they already were doing trading. Here's the problem. The language tells us everything. The Americans want to seize the assets. The Russians would want to trade with you. That's the actual difference. But the Americans project themselves and their own behaviors and personality traits as a state onto other states and presume that other states are the same as them. When you look at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, it was massive. There was, I think, over at least 700 billion in deals done, dollar value deals done in the first few days of the forum itself. Today has been very significant from the Russian international trade point of view. The Americans loaded on another 300 sanctions onto Russian companies. Russia's response today has to completely cease trading on its stock exchange in dollars. Completely cease trading. Haven't said they're going to reduce it. It's completely stopped from today. Everything that the Americans do speeds up the development of this new global economic system that's coming along, that is here. And that every one of those countries that went to the St. Petersburg Forum, every single one of them are aspiring BRICS candidates. That's why they went there. They're happy to work in a new BRICS world. So that's what's happening. I think you're going to talk about general Russian economic growth in the face of sanctions, or the teeth of sanctions, within the next few minutes anyway. But that growth is happening. But it's important to remember that Russia is not the powerhouse. Russia is the convener. That's what Russia's role is. It's convening BRICS. It's convening through events such as the event in St. Petersburg. It's convening the new world order and the new economic world order. But it is not the driving powerhouse. China and possibly India into the near future will be the powerhouses. But Russia has the diplomatic wherewithal and experience to make it happen. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, here's the other. This Turkey quite some time ago applied to join the EU, and for all sorts of reasons, including a bit of racism, I've got to say, Lloyd, because they don't want a Muslim country in. They've now done this. They've joined BRICS, and they're in there. And let's remember who's in there. It's not just any longer just Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa and China. We've also got UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Ethiopia, and it's growing all the time. There is, whether people they won't know about it, but whether like it or not, the pendulum is swinging, and the global south, with China and Russia at the head, are going to be controlling the economic structure of the world, are they not?
I think there's no question that that's the direction we're heading. But as a convinced peacenik like the two of you are, what I see in this is the great bonus of a shift of power away from the warmongers of the West, the European Union, Britain, and the United States. That the potentiality for what builds around BRICS will maybe. Well, I think it will lead to a rebalancing of the power, which may well be to the great benefit of the people of Palestine and the people of Libya and the people of Syria, all of whom, and of Afghanistan, all of whom have been under, war conditions for 10, 15, 20 years, in the Palestinians' case, 75 to 80 years. I would hope that there would be a rebalancing, and we will not, into the future, have this level of ignorance for the sake of maintaining relationships that are not beneficial to the vast majority of the people. There's no question that the country that fears, not in economic terms, but in political terms, fears the BRICS initiative more than any other is Israel. Of that, there's no question. As to the issue of Turkey, Erdogan is a very smart operator. He's also a brutal and vicious dictator. And it's one of the things that tends not to be spoken about is the manner in which Turkey deals with its own minorities and treats its own minorities, particularly the Kurdish minority in Turkey, is treated not unlike the Palestinians by the Turks. And this is something that people kind of don't like to talk about. Turkey's playing an interesting game here, and it has played both sides against the middle for a long time. The issue here, though, is Erdogan cozying up or appearing to cozy up to the BRICS countries to extirpate or to force the issue from the European Union of Turkey's membership? Or is Erdogan, the old fox, actually spotting that Europe's not the future for Turkey, that they actually need to be looking east and not west? But that's Turkey's internal problem, and has been since the creation of the Turkish state post-Ottoman Empire. Its constitution is a constitution of a country which separates very, very clearly religion from politics. It's also a country, though, that has replaced religion with national culture. If you, as a citizen of Turkey, irrespective of your cultural background, if you do not submit to Turkish culture, then you're an outsider, and you will be treated not unlike the way the Palestinians are treated by the Israelis. Turkey is currently facilitating oil into Israel, directly into Israel, while at the same time playing the game of saying we will cut off all economic ties. The fact of the matter is it's not doing that. It's playing an interesting game, and it will be interesting to see whether or not this is about Turkey levering the European Union, or maybe it's Turkey thinking that maybe the European Union is not for it anymore. And the difficulty for it that will come then is it will have to make a choice about whether it retains its NATO membership or it moves out of NATO and becomes either non-aligned or neutral. And that's where Turkey will discover that America, despite how many arms it provides for them, America is not its friend.
No, America's nobody's friend, let's be honest.
But doesn't Erdogan play the very same game as the Americans? He's playing with a different hand in many ways. But Turkey borders so many countries that are central to NATO's interests at the moment that he can play. It's a complicated game that he plays, but he can play the game. But just on a personal note about Erdogan and the lifestyle he leads because of his untrustworthiness, there was a video come out around the last elections in Turkey, which wasn't that long ago, and a member of staff in the video. So Erdogan was sitting with a load of people here, people behind him, crowds behind him, and his son was behind him. But a member of staff came up to hand him, and he looked quite ill, to hand him a glass of water. And he looked at the glass of water, he looked at the person serving, and he just shook his head. This person went away, and you could see him just handing the same glass of water to Erdogan's son, who came around and handed it to his father, and his father took it off him. So he lives a life of expecting to be assassinated at any time because of this Machiavellianism that compounds everything else. Can I make a point that Macron has played a similar game to Erdogan when it comes to BRICS? You may recall a few months ago that Macron actually requested to attend.
To be an observer, yeah.
To be an observer. So I think Western countries do not know how to take it. And if they were left to their own devices to think independently and in a sovereign manner, many of them would be thinking, maybe we should get in this BRICS game ourselves.
Yeah. Here's the thing, Lloyd. Russia is the most sanctioned country ever. Something like last time I looked, it was like 18,000 sanctions against them.
Or 300 today.
Yeah, how many?
300. 2,100.
So, but here is, according to the IMF, not to Russian propaganda, is they're now the fourth largest economy in the world. Now, not so long ago when this war started, we were told, oh, they've got an economy like Italy, and they'll run out of missiles and weapons in 2 days, and they only have got shovels and
a gas station, wasn't that it? All the hours
a gas station with whatever it was. But the fact is, with 18,000 sanctions, because they have realigned, they're now the fourth largest economy in the world and growing all the time. And the other in that four, we've got China at the top of the tree, Russia in four, India coming up fast on the inside. The power is shifting.
Yes, the power is shifting, and there's absolutely nothing that anybody can do about this. I think in some ways, if you look at the countries involved, with the exception of India, these are countries that have long-term planning at the center of their politics. They have a concept of history, both past and a future to build. So they don't operate on the electoral cycle. The problem that we have in the West is, and it kind of refers to something we talked about in the last program, is we're not only locked into the electoral cycle in our own countries, we're locked into the electoral cycle in the United States, because the electoral cycle in the United States for the West and the Northern Hemisphere affects the markets, it affects the distribution of goods and services across the world, and effectively controls to some degree our lives. When you're locked into a system where you're only thinking in terms of 3, 4, 5 years ahead, then you don't have the ability to compete with countries like China and Russia, who think in terms of 30, 40, 50 years. In fact, there was a quote from, I think it was the Chinese foreign minister, who said that, the difference between us and the West is that we understand that there's 1,000 years gone by and there will be 1,000 years ahead. A bold statement, but if you actually think about it, it gives you a real insight into the mindset. But getting back to the Russian sanctions, if anything tells us that war is profit, is the fact that Russia, despite the sanctions, its economy is growing and growing during a period of warfare. Now, that tells us everything that we need to know. The economy of Russia has developed massively under Putin, but it's been given a turbo boost by the stupidity and incompetence of the West in its dealings. As Finbar has said on many, many occasions, and I entirely agree with him, the Russians want to trade. They don't want to take, because they understand the responsibility, because they had those years as the Soviet Union, as being the premier, the leading organization or the leading country within that union. And they had to accept the responsibility for looking after others. They did it badly sometimes, they did it well at other times, but they don't want to be in a repeat situation. What they're doing now is that doing exactly what the Soviet Union was supposed to do, which China is doing, which is elevating your people by using the economy, but controlling the economy on a national basis rather than on this random basis of business to business, or allowing yourself to be dictated to by the stock market. Russia is not dictated to by the stock market in Moscow. or a stock market in China is dictated to by no stock market, whereas absolutely every country in the West, every country part of G20, every country part of G7, and every part of the European Union is effectively dictated to by the fluctuations of those very stock exchanges. And until we rid ourselves of that, we're not advancing forwards, and BRICS will advance forward. And maybe that's what our future politicians in Scotland need to start thinking about, is where are we going to align ourselves when finally we do become an independent country.
Can I just add to something there? You were talking about China having this, seeing things in 45th, taking this Confucian attitude into their government and seeing things in a more stoic manner, a non-reactionary manner, a non-emotive manner. Russia, through the Soviet Union, had a similar approach to things. They believed that governance should be scientific. Agriculture should be everything should be scientific. It didn't work at the beginning with agriculture, which caused famine in Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union. But their attitude has been this pragmatic, practical, non-knee-jerk, reactionary, scientific approach to things. And I can very much see that in the way Putin governs over the last 15 to 20 years. That it's the Americans come out with this extremist language, reactionary, emotive language all the time, which trying to start war, trying to start trouble. The Russians sit back, and we've got used to the Russians not responding, and people all sitting thinking, what are they up to? What is their overall plan? And that's really wrecking the heads of the people in NATO at the moment. As an example, they're really confused about why is it that the Russian army is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, yet they're not going for the coup de grace in Ukraine. To my mind, the reason is when they gameplay this, their game is much bigger than Ukraine. They're preparing for a war on all of their western borders, their southern borders, and their southeastern borders. That's what they're actually in preparation for. And they're doing it in a very scientific manner, a very methodological manner. Unlike the Americans and the Ukrainians, that every so often they want some dramatic, they're playing to the media all the time. Instead of using their very scarce missiles as an example, on the front line, or now currently in a defensive manner, because that's where they're at, they're on defense and they're running away. They're throwing them for media attention at Crimea and across the border into Russia. This emotive, unconsidered, non-scientific approach to war that they have. The Chinese have the history of Confucianism. They have a history of sitting. And so when I look at the attitude, the scientific attitude of the Russians, the Confucian attitude of the Chinese, take the names away, and they're actually very similar attitudes to how to govern. Yeah. In the West, it's the electoral cycle. It's about how do you slander your opposition? How do you say something more shocking than the last person? That's not the way it works around the majority of the world.
Finbar, do you think, a thing that's crossed my mind, particularly after seeing the Lindsey Graham clip yet again, is the United States has never got over, and it has not educated its people to understand that the Soviet Union doesn't exist. The Russian Federation is a radically different structure, but their entire approach is the Cold War approach. These, Lindsey Graham, the Cold Warrior, is living in a past, and the failure to recognize that they're not dealing with an old enemy. In fact, they're not really dealing with an enemy in real terms, or they could have been dealing with a friend, but they chose to maintain this attitude that the Russian bear of the mid-19th century of the Soviet Union is exactly the same now, when it clearly isn't. If it was the same, would there be a McDonald's?
The amount of Americans you see online who throw out still think that Russia's a communist country.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But those same people think that Joe Biden's a socialist, for God's sake.
No, they actually think Joe Biden actually is alive.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Here's the other thing.
That's interesting, Finbar. I saw Biden the other day, and I thought to myself, he looks like Chernenko. Do you remember Chernenko, who was the Soviet leader for a very short period of time? He was effectively dead when he got the job.
He looks like Ceausescu after he was shot.
But here's the other thing. You're talking about them being very practical, Finbar. But Techie, going to stick up the Iran. Here's where they're being very political. The Americans have said to the Ukrainians, you can fire into Russia, do what you like. A flotilla of Russian naval ships arrives in Cuba, nuclear submarines, frigates. And also, they do this deal with Iran. Can you stick up the Iran deal there, Techie? There we go. Now, they're going to give them nuclear submarines to Iran. The Su-35, they're going to allow them to produce them in Iran. They're super jets, they're fighter planes. They're going to give them T-14 Armata tanks, which is their latest, greatest battle tank. But more importantly, nuclear power plant assemblies, as well as the technology for intercontinental ballistic missiles. That is also political. It's not just a trading thing. That's them saying to the Americans,
it's messaging.
Saying to the Americans, oh, you think you can do it? Watch this.
But it reminds me a little bit of, do you remember in the early 80s, the Americans going on about Cuba, and that Cuba is an unfree country. It won't allow people to leave and come to America. So what did Castro do? He emptied the prisons and put them on planes and sent them to the prisons. Do you want to stay here in prison or do you want to go to America? Sent them all to America. And there's a kind of a sarcastic, but serious at the same time messaging in it. Last week in the Irish mainstream corporate media and public media, it was highlighting the big Russian threat. There's a report of a possible Russian nuclear submarine off the coast of Ireland. Didn't say that it was in international waters at the time. Off the coast of Ireland is a lot of sea, I can tell you. So, and it was a suspected Russian nuclear submarine. I'm not sure what was the suspected bit about it. Was it the nuclear bit? Was it the Russian bit? But it was a suspected nuclear submarine. And then that submarine appears to end up over in Cuba. And it's the Russians in a very clear and also a little bit sarcastic way saying, you did it to Ukraine and you said it was fine to put nuclear weapons, if you want, on the borders of our country. We're going over to do it against you. But here's the thing to measure. And about how time changes and how serious things really are. The last time the Russians did that, we had an international crisis. The whole world thought nuclear war was going to start within 2 days.
Yeah.
Things have got so serious now that something like that's not even that serious anymore. That's how serious things are.
Yeah. But how can the Americans complain if in a case, and I remember as a schoolboy, we were getting told there's going to be a nuclear war, go below your desk and put your hand above your head and you'll be fine. I mean, yeah. So
we were told to grab the nearest good-looking girl and give her a kiss. I'm not sure kind of what advice you were getting now.
Well, I'm an old boys' school, so let's leave it.
Well, you got to do what you got to do.
There you go. Takes all sorts to make up the world.
Take one for the Queen.
There, you put me right off. I've forgotten what the hell I was going to say there, Finbar. You're a terrible man. What were we talking about there? I can't remember what the hell we were talking about.
You were saying when you were a schoolboy, you could recall at the time.
They're going to. How can they complain if they put missiles into Cuba this time? They can't. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're telling the Ukrainians you can have them, Latvia you can have them, Lithuania, Finland, anyway. But as soon as you go to America, near America, oh, it's a different game.
But Roddy, what I find really entertaining about this, it shouldn't be entertaining, but it is. The missiles that the submarine carries can hit anywhere in the United States while it's sitting in its home base in the Arctic Sea or in Vladivostok. These missiles can hit anywhere. It's the fact that they're doing it. It's just it's saying, okay, let's play this game. It's slightly different about the hypersonic missiles that are carried by the frigates. Now that it's clear, Russia is not going to attack America from Cuba. That's not what's going on here. It's another flag saying we have friends, and we have friends very close to you. You don't have many friends. Now, anyone who would interpret the friendship visit of the Russian Navy to a country of which they have a friendship with is mistaking what's going on. But by the same token, the Russians are making a very, very clear statement, that they're allowed to do this now. They weren't allowed to do it in 1962. But then again, when you hear particularly the Russian foreign minister The Russian foreign minister strikes me as a man who's extremely clever, who can see solutions, and he's dealing with idiots. And sometimes he lets the mask slip. And some of the time when you see Ravlov look at someone, it's like, why are you not back at school? I mean, in some ways, it's like he looks careworn, but he's not careworn by the burden he carries of being the foreign minister of Russia. It's the burden of having to deal with complete and utter fools on a daily basis. People whose strategies and attitudes are so plainly obvious to someone of great diplomatic experience, a man who served under, both the systems, grew up under one system and has morphed brilliantly. I mean, if we had honest media, we would see Lavrov as someone who has a status far, far superior to the much lauded fascist Henry Kissinger. Because Lavrov is that kind. It's that quality of statesmanship. But unfortunately, he's playing on a field. It's a bit like the 1970 Brazil team playing against the pub team for round the corner. I mean, it really is. He has class and intellect, which is why when you see him with the Chinese, it's a completely different thing. It's clearly not a meeting of minds, but there is obvious respect there because they don't mess about with the bullshit.
Yeah.
As an example of that, there was I think it was Lavrov or Putin went to China a couple of weeks ago, and the red carpet went not just across the runway, but went up into the airplane. Was it the German equivalent landed?
He get met with the mayor. He get met by a mayor.
And I think they purposely put chewing gum all over the runway on him, chewed up chewing gum to make it the opposite of the red carpet. So you're 100% right. And when you see Lavrov visiting his compadres or his counterparts in other countries, there seems to be a genuine friendship between many of them. The way they shake hands, and they seem to know each other. Whereas when the Americans are coming, I think it's the fucking Americans are coming again. Jesus, there's going to be trouble in some way, for goodness sake. You like to see the Russians coming. They'll bring a packet of biscuits or something. The Americans just bring bloody trouble with them, So yeah, in every field, the Russians are excelling, and in every field, the Western Hemisphere is digressing, and it's down purely to their own behavior and their own attitudes.
Yeah, the Russians have got Lavrov. They've also got Maria Sarakovka.
Yeah. Now, Roddy, keep up here working. Keep down there for Germany.
I believe every word she says. I don't even know what she's saying. Anyway, that aside, but the other thing was we all know that the American Congress, I mean, quite incredible, Lloyd, has sanctioned the members of the ICC and the ICJ and their families. And this week, Techie, could you stick up that the UN has added Israel to the blacklist? Now, will the UN Congress, surely to God, they won't try and sanction the UN for bringing these war criminals to boot and blacklist them there with people like ISIS and Boko Haram? That's where Israel's at nowadays. Mm-hmm. Will they try and sanction the UN?
I think there's been moves within the Republican caucus to do that because the American politicians these days seem to have no concept of their place in the world other than being top of the tree and everybody's below them, which is not quite the America that so obviously. It's always been that, but it hasn't been as so obvious. The whole idea that America can even consider that it holds a premier position in the world, but it does not recognize the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court and hides behind this, we are America, we look after ourselves first. Isn't that exactly what they accuse every country that they claim as an enemy? Iran, China, Russia, Cuba. That's what they accuse them of, but it's what America actually does. The horror of this is that America behaves like an adolescent, and to some degree in the world stage, it is an adolescent in terms of the time it's existed. too many people seem to have this idea that, the United States has been here forever, but it hasn't. And in some ways, it's politics, as exemplified by Lindsey Graham, is the politics of the schoolyard.
Yeah.
It's the politics of the gang. You're in my gang or you're not in my gang. And it's an appalling, it's absolutely an appalling way to visualize the world. But then again, this is the country where the vast majority of its population does not have a passport. The vast majority of its population has never left the town that it's in, never mind the state that it's in. The vast majority of its population does not read. It's got one of the lowest levels. I'm not talking about literacy here. The literacy level is quite low, but their actual engagement with written material is one of the lowest in the world. Now, if you have a country with the power that it has, the claim that everybody wants to be America, everybody wants to come to America because it's such a wonderful country, but it seems to have little or no real regard for education, which, kind of going back the way a wee bit, is the very opposite of the ethos of all of the countries that are involved in BRICS, all of whom value education and the education of their population to a much, much higher level than the United States does. I said it in a program a few weeks ago. America's in the business of monetizing education and monetizing children. It's not in the business of education. Education is simply another business. And so long as that is the situation, then when are you going to get an adult in the room in the White House or in the Senate or in the Congress?
The educated people don't join the army as privates, so they can't afford to have educated people. The lifespan, the average lifespan in America is reducing. It's no longer the highest. China is dramatically increasing its lifespan for its population. The literacy levels are going down in the United States. The prison numbers are going up. To my mind, it's the personification of a failed state in many ways, but only failed for the mass majority. There's a minority, the people who are invested in the military-industrial complex, the people who are invested in the pharmaceutical industries. All those kind of people are doing really well in the United States. Everybody else is struggling and suffering. The idea that in any place, if you get cancer, that your worry is money about how to pay for your treatment, just the notion of it in a civilized society is horrific. That's taken for granted in the United States.
Yeah. There was a statistic came out, and I think the end of last week, Finbar. In last year alone, 530,000 Americans went bankrupt because of medical bills. It's absolutely incredible. And the vast majority of those people, well, number one, to go bankrupt, you've got to have assets to begin with. Anyone who's on Medicaid doesn't have assets. Yeah. So these are people who had pensions, who had savings, but they've lost all of their pensions, lost their savings, and have had to sell all of their goods and their property to provide themselves with medicine. How that can be considered.
Worse. There's common stories that I have heard from the United States that when a father finds out he's got cancer, he chooses to end his life rather than put his family in debt.
Yeah. That's the greatest country in the world. Here's another thing, though. Talking of politics, the Russians, are, I don't know, gaslighting's the right word, but they're smarter than them. Techie, can you stick up the debt to Africa that Russia says that the world owes? And this is the lovely Maria Zakharova, who was talking about relocating the UN headquarters to Africa and not to Switzerland, for example, because it should be a way of recompensing the Africans for the colonialism of the West. Now, I would be happy with that. I don't have a problem with that. I'm sure that our neoliberals and neoconservatives in the West have. But, Finbar, there's a certain fairness in that.
Well, to be honest with you, any international body should move around. to be honest with you, every 5 years or whatever the case might be. And why shouldn't a country in Africa have the opportunity to host the United Nations for 5 years? Why shouldn't a country in Asia have the opportunity to host that? Just before we go there, though, you reminded me, Roddy, of your introduction of the female Russian spokeswoman or spokesperson. You remind me of a fella I knew when we were activists campaigning against evictions in Ireland. And he was a nice old gentleman, but he had a very deep voice. But whenever he met one of our members who was a good-looking woman, his voice suddenly went like this, and he went, "Well, hello, my dear." Like this. So it'd be deeper. "Well, hello, my dear." And just every time you say that Russian woman's name, I can hear it in your voice.
What can I tell you? What can I tell you? I like Eastern European women. What can I tell you?
Oh, we won't.
Especially my darling wife.
Let's not open that bag. Oh, but just in terms, yeah. Listen, I think again, it's a little bit of sarcasm on the part of the Russians. Again, it's a bit like during the Soviet Union, the Russians only ever had to point at the apartheid system that existed in the United States to be able to avoid having to deal with its own inconsistencies with its own society. You know, so it's a similar kind of a thing.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, you know, the problem is when even in movies, when the aliens arrive, they always go to America. They never go to Africa.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think Africa deserves
aliens.
I would certainly back it up. But here's the other thing: should Israel be kicked out of the UN? I know they won't be, but I'm saying should they be?
That's the hardest thing, Roddy, is we can talk about it, but we know that they're so well protected, nothing will happen at present. But going back to our conversation about BRICS, that could make huge changes in the way things are done. But the way the United Nations is currently configured, I can't see moves being made against Israel. There is no question at all. Israel should have been removed from the United Nations at least 50 years ago. It certainly should have been removed after the 67 war. It certainly should have been removed after its reaction at the 73 war. And it certainly should have been removed after the massacres at Sabra and Shatila in 1982 in Lebanon. You know, no country in the world in the 20th century got away with what Israel has got away with in both the 20th and the 21st century. It's utterly and completely appalling. But on a more positive note, the United Nations Security Council, whether you reform the United Nations or not, United Nations Security Council is the most important body that needs massive reform, and the veto has to be removed. And there is one way that possibly could begin to happen. And it's a way that involves us here in Scotland.
Yeah.
If Scotland becomes an independent country, then I think it would be extremely difficult for the so-called United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to, well, by that time it won't have a Northern Ireland either. It will be the United Kingdom of England. It would be very hard to argue that it retains its permanent position on the UN Security Council. Now, we all know that the principal reason that it holds that position is because it is a nuclear weapons powered country. Those nuclear weapons are retained within our national boundary. And when we become independent and we remove those nuclear weapons, and the English say that they have nowhere to put them, that's why they are kept on the Clyde, then will they get rid of their nuclear weapons? At which point, if they do get rid of the nuclear weapons, then they have there is no reason whatsoever for them to retain their Security Council position and veto. But without a removal, and maybe that's something that we need to very firmly get into the playbook of the independence movement, is our potential influence in an international world when we become independent in a very big way, because the removal of Scotland from the United Kingdom reduces England to a rump. The economy will be nothing like what it was. It will not be able to argue its corner except with its American friend if that happens. And maybe that would be, maybe that's the biggest gift that Scotland could give to the world in the 21st century. is in actual fact, by the creation of our independence, we create a new form of Security Council, or we remove at least Britain from the Security Council. And that in itself would be a huge step forward for the world.
Here's here. Last point I want to make, because the clock again's kicking on here, Finbar, and I know you have to be elsewhere. The recent Nusayrat massacre, where the Israelis rescued, for want of a better word, 4 IDF soldiers who were being held hostage or prisoners of war. They killed 274 civilians, 698 wounded. But it's now come out that they arrived in aid vehicles, hidden in aid vehicles, and they'd come from the pier that the Americans had built to bring in aid to the starving population. Does this now mean that not just Israel, but the US, who apparently had special forces embedded as well, should also be going to the international court?
That entire process seems to have been a breach of international law, not just the killing of all those civilians, but the entire process, the use of a humanitarian vehicles, the use of an alleged humanitarian harbor, all this kind of jazz. That's all against international law. But the bottom line is, anybody who has a good idea of the pattern or behavior of the likes of these people knew from day one that this pier was nothing to do with humanitarian aid. It was to serve one particular mission. This so-called effort to free hostages, that was just a PR exercise. It was a bloody disaster. More hostages were killed, I believe, than were actually saved, as we want to say it. And many of those hostages were, in fact, Israeli soldiers. So the fact that Americans were snuck in to participate in this, which that appears to be the case now, the fact that this happened at all, it's just another thing in the list. You were speaking about removing Israel from the UN Security Council and even the UN generally. Israel has breached so much international law that's been created specifically about their case over the last 50 years that there shouldn't, if you were a member of a professional body, you would have been kicked out years ago. Yeah. If you were a member of any other organ, you would have been kicked out because you're breaching all of the rules constantly. So the idea that they're still in there at all. But what happened with that massacre is just another one horrific incident that has occurred on the list. But I think that it's not the UN going to kick Israel out. Israel is kicking itself out of the UN. It's pulling itself out in bits and pieces over the last few weeks. They announced they're not going to cooperate with this UN body. They're not going to cooperate because the UN bodies, research bodies that are supposed to go in to check on war crimes, to look at what's happening, they're not being allowed in by the Israelis, because everything that the Israelis says, this atrocity pornography that they're constantly coming out with, is easily disproved. And so the UN is the biggest danger to Israel if it retains that relationship with them, because it means that the UN will show the world with the proofs of what Israel is doing in its harsh statistics that it's going to produce. And so Israel does not want to be a part of the UN, as far as I can see. I can see the United States and Israel actually leaving the UN, and the UN will become BRICS too.
That would be fabulous. I hope that does happen. I hope it does. Gentlemen, the clock is beating us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom, your comments, and everything else. And you, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this. Until I see you, and my friends here see you again, you and yours, please, take care.
Bye-bye, guys.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.